Dance this waltz, you can marry my son. Victoria Whitmore's cruel laughter echoed through the marble ballroom as she stood over the black woman kneeling among broken champagne flutes. 200 elite guests turned to stare at Grace Thompson, who had just shattered their perfect evening along with the Crystal Tower. "Of course, that's assuming you even know what a waltz is," Victoria added, her voice dripping with venom as she gestured toward her son James and his pristine fiancée Priscilla. "People like you don't exactly grow up learning proper dance, do they?" Grace's hands trembled as champagne soaked through her black uniform. The crystal shards glittered around her like broken dreams, each piece reflecting the disgusted faces above. Victoria's diamond necklace blazed under the chandelier light, her smile promising further humiliation. The crowd's laughter was immediate and brutal. Have you ever been crushed so publicly that even breathing felt like an act of defiance? 3 months earlier, Grace Thompson had stood in this same ballroom, watching Victoria Whitmore inspect her flower arrangements with the precision of a surgeon examining a tumor. "I suppose this is adequate," Victoria had said, running her manicured finger along a rose petal. "For someone who will never plan her own wedding, of course." The words had landed like slaps, each one carefully calculated to remind Grace of her place in the world's hierarchy. This was Victoria's favorite game, the marriage taunts. Every interaction contained some reminder that Grace, at 28, was unmarried, unmarriageable, and unworthy of the life that surrounded her daily. While serving breakfast, "Grace, set the table properly. If you can't serve correctly, how could you ever be served at your own wedding?" While dusting the family portraits, "These women all married well." I suppose not everyone is blessed with such opportunities. Grace had learned to swallow these insults like bitter medicine, each one adding to the weight she carried in her chest. She needed this job. Her mother's medical bills from the experimental cancer treatment in Atlanta weren't going to pay themselves, and positions that paid well enough to cover both rent and medicine were scarce for someone with her background. But Victoria didn't know about Grace's background. Not the real one. She didn't know that Grace's bedroom contained a worn leather suitcase hidden beneath the bed, inside of which lay a faded dance competition program from 1994. Samuel Thompson, World Ballroom Champion. She didn't know about the acceptance letter to Juilliard that Grace still kept in her jewelry box, or the worn ballet shoes that had once carried dreams of stages and spotlights. Most of all, Victoria didn't know about the small gold locket Grace wore beneath her uniform, the one containing her father's wedding ring and a photo of him dipping her mother in perfect waltz position, both of them laughing like they held all the joy in the world. Samuel Thompson had taught his daughter that dancing was conversation without words, that every step told a story, and that the right partner could make you feel like you were flying. He'd died when Grace was 19, leaving behind medical debt that forced her to abandon Juilliard and everything it represented. The dancing stopped. The dreaming stopped. Life became about survival instead of art. Now, 6 years later, Grace moved through the Whitmore mansion like a ghost, invisible except when her visibility served someone else's purpose. She watched James practice his engagement waltz with Priscilla in the very ballroom where she'd been humiliated tonight, their movements stilted and mechanical, all technique, no soul. She served tea while Victoria planned wedding details with the calculating precision of a corporate merger. "Marriage is about compatibility," Victoria would say, reviewing catering options with Priscilla. "Breeding, education, social position, romance is for movies and poor people." The irony wasn't lost on Grace. Victoria, who measured everything by bloodlines and bank accounts, had no idea that her maid possessed more dance training than anyone in her social circle. Grace could execute a perfect Viennese waltz, lead a passionate tango, and command a ballroom with the grace her father had spent years perfecting. But those skills belonged to a different life, a different girl who had believed the world would make room for her dreams. Some nights, when the house was quiet and her work was finished, Grace would find herself moving to music only she could hear. Her body remembered what her mind tried to forget. The feeling of floating across a floor, the electricity of perfect partnership, the moment when technique became art, and art became magic. But those were stolen moments, private resurrections of a dead dream. In the morning, she would return to being invisible Grace, the maid who couldn't possibly understand the sophistication required for their world. Tonight had started like any other evening of Victoria's social theater. The engagement announcement party was meant to display the Whitmore family's continued dominance in society's pecking order. James, dutiful if reluctant, stood beside Priscilla, while Victoria orchestrated every detail with military precision. The champagne tower was meant to sparkle like their future crystal perfection, reflecting inherited wealth. Grace had been serving carefully, knowing that any mistake would provide Victoria with fresh ammunition for her cruelty. She hadn't expected someone to bump into her tray. She certainly hadn't expected Victoria to transform the accident into an opportunity for public humiliation. But as she knelt among the broken glass, feeling 200 pairs of eyes judging her worth, something stirred in Grace's chest. It wasn't just anger or embarrassment, it was recognition. The same feeling she'd had before every competition, every performance, every moment when she'd had to prove that Samuel Thompson's daughter belonged on any stage she chose to grace. Victoria had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. She'd challenged a champion. The champagne had barely been cleaned away when disaster struck again. Victoria's phone buzzed with the kind of urgency that made her diamond-heavy fingers tremble. The Vienna-trained waltz instructor, the one she'd been bragging about for weeks, had just canceled. Family emergency. No replacement available. "This cannot be happening!" Victoria hissed into her phone, her voice carrying across the ballroom where 200 elite guests mingled, unaware that their evening's promised entertainment was evaporating. "The Astors are here! The Vanderbilts drove up from the city. I specifically promised them authentic European ballroom dancing." James approached his mother cautiously, recognizing the dangerous edge in her voice. "Mother, perhaps we could simply skip the dancing portion, the engagement announcement itself." "Skip it?" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "James, your engagement party will be discussed in social circles for months. Do you want them remembering it as the evening the Whitmores couldn't deliver on their promises?" Priscilla joined them, her blonde curls still perfect despite the evening's chaos. "Surely someone else could demonstrate." "I took lessons at finishing school, though nothing too advanced." Victoria waved her off impatiently. Her reputation was built on exclusivity, on providing experiences that lesser families couldn't match. A simple waltz demonstration by an amateur would be worse than nothing. It would be ordinary. That's when her eyes found Grace. Grace was quietly collecting the last of the crystal shards, her movements efficient and unnoticed. Something about the careful precision of her actions, the natural grace even in this menial task, sparked an idea in Victoria's calculating mind. Not a solution, something far more entertaining. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria's voice rang out across the ballroom, commanding immediate attention. The conversations died as 200 faces turned toward her. "I have a special announcement." Grace froze, a shard of crystal still in her palm. She recognized that tone, the one that preceded Victoria's most creative cruelties. "Since our professional instructor couldn't join us this evening," Victoria continued, her smile sharp as broken glass, "I've decided we should have some authentic entertainment instead. Our Grace here will demonstrate a traditional waltz for us." The crowd murmured with interest and barely concealed amusement. Grace felt her stomach drop. "And," Victoria's voice rose triumphantly, "I stand by what I said earlier. If Grace can dance this waltz like a true lady with proper technique, proper grace, proper breeding, then perhaps she really could marry my son." The ballroom erupted in laughter and applause. The game had begun. The ballroom fell silent except for the sound of Grace's breathing. 200 pairs of eyes waited for her response, their faces ranging from curious to cruel. Victoria's smile was razor-sharp, confident in her trap. This was meant to be Grace's final humiliation, a public demonstration of why people like her should never reach above their station. Grace's fingers instinctively moved to the locket beneath her uniform, feeling the outline of her father's wedding ring through the fabric. For a moment, she was 8 years old again, standing in Samuel Thompson's Harlem dance studio, watching him glide across the floor with a grace that made gravity seem optional. "Grace, baby," his voice echoed in her memory. "Dancing isn't about the steps. It's about telling your story with your whole heart. And our story? Our story is that we belong anywhere music plays." The weight of 18 years pressed against her chest, 18 years of watching her dreams collect dust while she scrubbed other people's floors. 18 years of swallowing insults and biting back words that could have cut deeper than any knife. 18 years of being invisible in a world that judged worth by wallet size. But Victoria had just made one crucial mistake. She thought Grace was powerless. She thought the maid who cleaned her toilets and served her champagne had nothing left to lose. She was wrong. Grace straightened slowly, her posture shifting in a way that made several guests lean forward unconsciously. The broken crystal forgotten, she looked directly into Victoria's eyes for the first time in 3 years of employment. "I accept your challenge, Mrs. Whitmore." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of surprise through the crowd. Victoria's confident smile flickered, just for a moment before returning with renewed viciousness. "How delightful," Victoria purred, though her voice carried a new edge of uncertainty. "I do hope you won't embarrass yourself too badly. After all, dancing requires a certain breeding." "You're absolutely right," Grace replied, her voice steady as mountain stone. "Dancing does require breeding, the kind that runs in the blood and shows in the bones, the kind that can't be bought or inherited, only earned." She touched the locket one more time, feeling her father's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. "If I can dance this waltz with the grace and skill you claim I lack, will you honor your word about marriage? In front of all these witnesses?" Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, my dear child, when you fail, and you will fail, perhaps you'll finally understand your place in this world." Grace smiled, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt like herself again. The daughter of a champion was about to dance. The next 15 minutes would either destroy Grace Thompson or resurrect her. Victoria's voice rang across the ballroom with theatrical authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, clear the floor. Let's see if our Grace truly has what it takes to be marriage material." The crowd parted like an expensive sea, their champagne glasses glinting as they formed a circle around the polished marble dance floor. Phones appeared in manicured hands, not to capture art, but to record what they assumed would be spectacular failure. The kind of social media content that would circulate for weeks. "You won't believe what happened when the maid tried to dance at the Whitmore party." James stood frozen beside his mother, his face a mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been concerning. Priscilla whispered something that made nearby guests snicker. The anticipation in the room was thick enough to cut with crystal. "Now then," Victoria continued, savoring every moment, "we'll need proper music. Something classical. Sophisticated. The Blue Danube, perhaps?" She nodded to the pianist they'd hired for background ambiance. "And Grace will need a partner, naturally. James, would you do the honors?" This was the cruelest part of Victoria's trap. Not only would Grace have to attempt something she supposedly couldn't do, but she'd have to do it while dancing with the very man she was supposedly trying to marry. The humiliation was designed to be absolute. James reluctantly stepped forward, his face flushed with the mortification of a man trapped between his mother's expectations and his own discomfort. "Grace, I'm sorry about this. We don't have to." "Yes, we do," Grace interrupted quietly. her voice carrying a certainty that made him look at her more carefully. Something had changed in her bearing, in the way she held her shoulders. But first, I need to change. Victoria's eyebrows shot up. Change? Into what? Your formal maid's uniform? Into something more appropriate for dancing, Grace replied, then turned to address the room. If you'll excuse me for just 5 minutes, I promise you won't be disappointed. The murmur that ran through the crowd was electric with anticipation and mockery. Grace walked toward the service stairs with her head held high, leaving behind 200 people who thought they knew exactly what kind of show they were about to see. What they didn't know was that Grace Thompson kept more than memories hidden beneath her narrow service bed. When she returned, the ballroom fell silent. Gone was the simple black uniform that had rendered her invisible for 3 years. In its place, Grace wore a dress that seemed to capture moonlight and hold it prisoner. Her grandmother's vintage ballroom gown from 1952, ivory silk that flowed like water and hugged her figure in all the right places. The dress had been waiting 18 years for this moment, preserved in tissue paper and hope. But it wasn't just the dress that transformed her. Grace moved differently now, her posture carrying the unmistakable bearing of someone who belonged on a dance floor. Her hair, freed from its servant's bun, fell in elegant waves around her shoulders. And around her neck, visible for the first time, hung her father's gold locket, a talisman against every cruel word that had ever been spoken about her worth. The guests' phones were still recording, but the energy had shifted. This was no longer a woman they expected to stumble. This was someone who commanded attention simply by existing in the space. Victoria's confident smirk faltered as she took in the transformation. "Well," she said, her voice slightly strained, "I suppose we can begin." The pianist's fingers found the opening notes of Strauss's An der schönen blauen Donau, the Blue Danube Waltz, the melody that had soundtracked 1,000 ballrooms, 1,000 love stories, 1,000 moments when two people became one on a dance floor. Grace turned to James and executed a perfect curtsy, not the submissive bow of a servant, but the elegant acknowledgement of one dancer to another. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in 3 years of serving him breakfast and pressing his shirts, James saw her, really saw her. "May I have this dance?" she asked, extending her hand. James took it, and the moment their fingers touched, he felt the subtle strength there, the kind of controlled power that came from years of training. His confusion deepened. Then Grace placed her right hand on his shoulder, raised her left arm in perfect waltz frame, and everything changed. The opening steps of a Viennese waltz are deceptively simple, a basic box step that any ballroom novice can manage. But what Grace executed was something far beyond basic. Her first movement was liquid perfection, her frame so impeccable that James found himself naturally falling into better posture just to match her standard. The crowd's anticipatory laughter died in their throats. Grace led, not obviously, not aggressively, but with the subtle guidance of someone who understood that partnership meant making your partner look their absolute best. James, who had been stumbling through engagement dance lessons for months, suddenly found himself moving with a grace he'd never possessed. As they completed their first circuit of the floor, Grace began to incorporate technique that made several of the older guests lean forward in recognition. Natural turns executed with the floating quality that marked true Viennese style. Perfect rise and fall, the kind of effortless rotation that made it seem like the dancers were skating on air. "My God," whispered Mrs. Ashford, the doyenne of New York society whose own ballroom credentials were legendary. "That's competition-level technique." Grace heard the whisper and something sparked in her eyes. Not triumph, but homecoming. This was who she was. Not the invisible maid, not the woman who cleaned up other people's messes, but Samuel Thompson's daughter. The girl who had floated across floors in Harlem dance studios and dreamed of stages that stretched beyond her neighborhood's boundaries. The music swelled, and Grace's dancing evolved with it. She began incorporating variations that showcased not just her technical skill, but her artistry. Subtle fleckerls that added texture to their movement. A promenade that opened into a perfect reverse turn. Dancing that told a story, her story. James was no longer just following. He was caught up in something magical. The woman in his arms moved with such certainty, such joy, that he found himself smiling for the first time all evening. This wasn't the stilted, obligatory dancing he'd done with Priscilla. This was conversation without words, exactly like his secret romantic fantasies had imagined dancing could be. The crowd was no longer recording for mockery. Phones captured genuine artistry now, the kind of performance that would be shared not as a joke, but as something beautiful and unexpected. The ballroom had become a theater, and Grace Thompson was its prima ballerina. Victoria watched her trap transform into a stage, her face growing paler with each perfect turn. This wasn't supposed to happen. The maid was supposed to stumble, to prove once and for all that breeding mattered, that some people simply didn't belong in her world. Instead, Grace was proving that she belonged anywhere she chose to be. The final notes of the waltz approached, and Grace led James into a closing sequence that left no doubt about her abilities. A series of natural turns that built in intensity before settling into a final, perfect bow. As the music ended, they stood in the center of the ballroom, James slightly breathless, Grace radiant with the joy of someone who had remembered what it felt like to be truly alive. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then the applause began. Not polite society clapping, but genuine appreciation from people who recognized excellence when they saw it. Mrs. Ashford was on her feet. Several other guests followed. The phones that had been recording for scandal were now capturing something that would be remembered as the moment Grace Thompson announced her true self to the world. Victoria stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. Grace curtsied once more, this time to the audience, her smile bright enough to power the chandeliers. When she straightened, her eyes found Victoria's across the room. "Thank you for the dance, Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying perfectly across the marble and crystal. "I hope it met your standards for breeding." The gauntlet had been thrown, and everyone in the room knew it. Victoria Whitmore had not clawed her way to the top of New York society by accepting defeat gracefully. As applause died and Grace stood radiant in her ballroom, Victoria's mind raced through damage control scenarios with corporate efficiency. "How delightful," Victoria said, voice carrying across marble with practiced composure. Those who knew her detected hairline cracks in her armor. "You've clearly had some basic training, Grace." Quite surprising for someone in your position. The crowd murmured agreement, several guests approaching Grace with genuine compliments. Victoria watched her social hierarchy threatening to crumble in real time. "Of course," Victoria continued, raising her voice to reclaim attention, "any competent instructor could teach basic waltz steps. The true test of a dancer and a lady is adaptability, partnership, the ability to handle intensity." Grace felt the trap closing even as triumph coursed through her veins. She recognized the predatory gleam in Victoria's eyes, the look preceding every orchestrated humiliation over 3 years. "What are you suggesting, Mother?" James asked, still breathless from their dance. Something protective had entered his voice, surprising everyone, including himself. Victoria smiled with cobra warmth. "Since Grace seems confident about her abilities, perhaps we should see how she handles a more sophisticated challenge." She gestured toward the pianist. "The tango, I think. Argentina's gift to passionate souls. Surely someone who considers herself worthy of marrying into our family can handle the dance of desire?" The suggestion landed like a bomb. Several guests exchanged knowing looks. Tango was notorious for its intimate nature, demands for physical closeness and emotional vulnerability. Victoria wasn't just escalating the challenge, she was pushing Grace into territory designed to expose her as fundamentally unsuited for their refined world. "Mother," James began uncomfortably, "that's hardly—" "It's perfect," Grace interrupted, voice cutting through his objection like silk through steel. Every eye turned to her, and she felt familiar electricity preceding every competition where everything was on the line. This was Victoria's mistake, assuming a more challenging dance would expose Grace's limitations. Victoria didn't understand that Grace had been trained by a world champion who believed true dancers could tell any story, express any emotion, or command any floor. "But," Grace continued, smiling sharp enough to cut crystal, "if we're dancing tango properly, we should acknowledge what it represents. The dance of equals, partners who challenge each other, push boundaries, refuse to be diminished." She turned to James, words meant for his mother. In competitive tango, traditional leader-follower roles often switch. The woman leads just as much as the man. I hope that won't be uncomfortable for anyone. The challenge was unmistakable. Victoria's eyes narrowed, realizing Grace was turning this trap into another opportunity. "How unconventional," Victoria said, tone dripping disapproval. "In proper society, men lead and women follow. It's the natural order." "Is it?" Grace asked, moving toward James with fluid grace that had just captivated the ballroom. "Or is that just what people say when they're afraid of what happens when everyone gets to show their true strength?" The crowd sensed something larger than dance happening. This wasn't about steps and rhythm. This was about power, about who decided who belonged where, about whether worth was inherited or earned. James looked between his mother and Grace, feeling the weight of an unexpected choice. The safe path was obvious: defer to mother, maintain status quo, protect inheritance. But looking at Grace, seeing fire in her eyes and remembering how it felt to dance with someone who made him feel capable of magic, the safe path suddenly seemed like cowardice. "I'd be honored to dance with you, Grace," he said quietly, extending his hand. "And if you want to lead, I'll follow." Victoria's face went white with rage, but before she could speak, Mrs. Ashford's voice cut through tension. "How refreshing," the society matriarch declared, approval carrying decades of weight in elite circles. A young man secure enough to let talent shine, regardless of who's providing it. The pianist began opening notes of La Comparsita, the most famous tango in the world, music that had soundtracked 1,000 passionate encounters and dramatic confrontations. Grace took James's hand, stepped into his space, and smiled with the confidence of someone who had just realized her opponent had handed her the perfect weapon. Victoria's sabotage was about to become Grace's triumph. The opening notes of La Comparsita pulsed through the ballroom, and Grace Thompson became someone else entirely. She stepped into James's space with predatory grace, understanding exactly what tango demanded: the ability to seduce an entire room through movement. Her left hand found his shoulder, her right settled into his palm, and suddenly the hesitant Whitmore air was dancing with a force of nature. Grace led with subtle authority that made James respond instinctively, his body following hers through sequences he'd never learned. She guided him into ochos, showcasing her fluid spine, volcatas requiring absolute trust, ganchos demonstrating partnership so intimate it made society matrons fan themselves nervously. Every movement proved a point. When she executed a perfect bolio, leg extending with knife-sharp precision, she showed them power and femininity could coexist. When she led James into dramatic dips, reversing traditional roles with natural authority, she rewrote their assumptions about strength. The crowd was mesmerized. Phones captured every turn, every moment when Grace's eyes locked with James's and electricity passed between them. This wasn't a maid trying to dance above her station. This was passion made visible, technique transformed into poetry. Mrs. Ashford whispered to her companion, voice carrying in the breathless silence. That's conservatory level. Professional level. Victoria heard and felt her world tilting further. Other guests nodded, murmuring extraordinary and stunning. As the tango reached its climax, Grace led James through turns building in intensity before settling into the traditional close bodies pressed together, eyes locked, desire and surrender captured in stillness. The music ended. Silence stretched 5 seconds before applause erupted louder, more genuine, punctuated by actual bravos from guests who recognized they'd witnessed something special. Grace stepped back, breathing controlled, smile radiant with joy of remembering her capabilities. James looked dazed, face flushed, eyes fixed on her with wonder. That was, he began, then stopped, lacking adequate words. Victoria stood frozen, fury barely controlled, watching her son look at the help like she was Helen of Troy. Grace had proven she could dance. Now Victoria had to honor her word. The standing ovation was still echoing through the ballroom when Victoria Whitmore made her decision. If Grace Thompson wanted to play in the big leagues, she was about to learn that the house always had the final card. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria's voice cut through the applause like a blade through silk. What a fascinating display. Though I suppose we should take a brief intermission before continuing our evening's entertainment. She moved toward Grace with predatory grace, her smile never wavering even as her eyes promised destruction. Grace, dear, might I have a word? Privately? It wasn't a request. James stepped forward instinctively. Mother, whatever you need to say. Can wait, Victoria finished smoothly. This is between ladies. Grace understands, don't you, dear? Grace felt the trap closing but lifted her chin. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. Victoria led her toward a secluded alcove near the service entrance, away from the lingering guests and their curious stares. The moment they were alone, Victoria's mask slipped entirely. I know exactly who you are, Grace Thompson, she said, her voice dripping venom. Daughter of Samuel Thompson, the street dancer from Harlem who got lucky at a few competitions. Grace's blood chilled, but she kept her expression neutral. I never hid my background. Didn't you? Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. What about your current situation? The 3 months of unpaid rent? Your mother's medical bills piling up in Atlanta? The experimental cancer treatment that costs $50,000? Each word hit Grace like a physical blow. She'd been so careful, so private about her family's struggles. How could Victoria possibly know? I had you investigate the moment you applied for this position, Victoria continued, savoring Grace's shock. A young woman with your breeding doesn't usually end up scrubbing toilets for people like us unless there's desperation involved. Grace's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. What do you want? Reality, Victoria said simply. Your little performance was charming, truly. But let's discuss what actually matters. You owe your landlord $12,000. Your mother's treatment starts next month and insurance won't cover experimental procedures. She paused, letting the weight of those numbers settle like stones in Grace's chest. Here's your choice, dear girl. You can continue this charade, pretend you're something you're not, and I'll make one phone call. By tomorrow morning, you'll be evicted. Your mother's doctors will be informed that payment isn't coming, and I'll ensure that no family in our social circle will ever employ you again. Grace felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Her mother's face flashed in her mind. The woman who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for Grace's dance lessons, who'd smiled through chemo treatments and pretended she wasn't scared. Or, Victoria continued, her voice softening into mock sympathy, you can be practical. Return to the ballroom, tell our guests that tonight was simply entertainment, that you got carried away, forgot your place. Acknowledge that someone like you could never truly be marriage material for someone like James. And if I do that? Victoria's smile was triumphant. I'll pay for your mother's treatment. In full. I'll also cover your back rent and give you a generous severance package. All you have to do is remember who you really are. Grace closed her eyes, seeing her mother's trusting face, hearing her father's voice telling her that dignity was the one thing no one could take away unless you gave it freely. You want me to humiliate myself publicly, Grace said quietly. I want you to be honest, Victoria corrected, to stop pretending you're something you're not. A few pretty dance moves don't erase where you come from or where you belong. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken ultimatums and impossible choices. Grace thought about James's hands in hers, the feeling of being seen for the first time in years, the moment when the entire ballroom had recognized her worth. Then she thought about her mother lying in a hospital bed, trusting her daughter to find a way. How long do I have to decide? Grace asked. Victoria checked her diamond watch. The guests are expecting an explanation for our little intermission. I'd say you have about 5 minutes to choose between pride and practicality. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Grace? If you're thinking of telling James about our conversation, remember that his trust fund comes with certain expectations about appropriate relationships. He may be momentarily infatuated, but when faced with disinheritance, even the most romantic young man becomes surprisingly practical. Grace stood alone in the alcove, her grandmother's dress suddenly feeling like a costume, her father's locket weighing heavy around her neck. Through the archway, she could hear the guests' laughter and see James scanning the crowd looking for her. 5 minutes to choose between everything she'd ever dreamed of being and everything her family needed to survive. The clock was ticking. Grace stood in the alcove for 30 seconds before making her decision. Not the one Victoria expected. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed a number she knew by heart. Mama? Her voice cracked slightly. Grace, baby. How's work tonight? Mama, if I had to choose between my pride and your treatment... Grace Thompson, her mother's voice sharpened with authority. You stop that thinking right now. Remember what your daddy used to say about the last dance? Grace closed her eyes, hearing Samuel Thompson's voice. Baby girl, if it's your last dance, make it count for everyone who can't dance. But Mama, the money will come from somewhere else. The Lord didn't give you those gifts to hide them. Now go show them who Samuel Thompson raised. The line went quiet. Her mother had hung up. For the first time in hours, Grace smiled. When Grace returned to the ballroom, social dynamics had shifted dramatically. James stood near the piano, fielding questions from genuinely curious guests. Mrs. Ashford was holding court, her voice carrying clearly. I haven't seen a technique like that since Blackpool '98, the society matriarch was saying. Whoever trained that young woman knew their craft. But surely, Priscilla simpered, voice tight with jealousy, anyone can learn to dance with practice. It doesn't mean anything about breeding. Doesn't it? Mrs. Ashford's eyebrows rose imperiously. My dear child, you can't fake that natural grace. Either you have it or you don't. That girl has it in spades. Several guests nodded agreement. While Victoria delivered ultimatums, public opinion had crystallized in Grace's favor. Where is Grace? James asked, scanning the room with concern. She should be here accepting compliments. Oh, I'm sure she's just freshening up, Victoria said smoothly, appearing beside him. These evenings can overwhelm someone from her background. That's when Grace made her entrance. She walked directly to the ballroom's center, her bearing regal despite the storm in her chest. Conversations died as guests turned to face her. Ladies and gentlemen, Grace began, voice carrying clearly across crystal and marble, Mrs. Whitmore has asked me to share something about tonight's dancing. Victoria's face went pale with anticipated victory. She's right that I should be honest about who I am, Grace continued, hand moving to her father's locket. So let me tell you about my background. She opened the locket, revealing the photograph inside. This is my father, Samuel Thompson, the 1994 World Ballroom Dance Champion. He taught me that dancing isn't about where you come from, it's about where you're willing to go. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Ashford straightened with recognition. Samuel Thompson, the older woman breathed. I saw him compete at Madison Square Garden. He was magnificent. He was, Grace agreed, voice growing stronger. He also taught me that worth isn't measured by bank accounts or addresses. It's measured by how you treat others and what you stand up for. James stepped forward, face flushed with admiration. Grace, you don't have to explain anything. Yes, I do, Grace replied, looking directly at Victoria. Because some people think talent and dignity are things you can buy or inherit. My father proved that wrong every time he stepped on a dance floor. She turned to address the entire room. Tonight, Mrs. Whitmore said if I could dance like a lady, I could marry her son. Well, I danced, and I danced well. But I want something clear. The ballroom was dead silent. I don't need permission to be worthy of love. I don't need approval to know my value, and I don't need to marry into respect when I can earn my own. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. However, Grace continued, smiling sharp as crystal, Mrs. Whitmore made a public promise. In front of 200 witnesses, I'm curious to see if a woman who claims to value breeding will keep her word. The crowd turned as one to stare at Victoria, whose world was crumbling in real time. Mrs. Ashford began clapping slowly. James joined her. One by one, the entire ballroom erupted in applause. Grace had turned Victoria's weapon into her shield. Victoria Whitmore stood trapped in the center of her own ballroom, 200 pairs of eyes boring into her like spotlights. The applause for Grace had died, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to pulse with expectation. Well, Victoria? Mrs. Ashford's voice cut through the quiet with the authority of someone who'd been judging social worthiness for 5 decades. The young woman has certainly fulfilled her part of the bargain. Are you a woman of your word? Victoria's face cycled through emotions like a broken kaleidoscope: rage, panic, calculation, desperation. She looked at James, who was staring at Grace with undisguised admiration. She looked at the crowd of elite guests, their phones still recording, waiting to see if she would honor a promise made in jest or reveal herself as someone whose word meant nothing. Victoria began, then stopped. Her mind raced through possible escapes, but every path led to social suicide. Renege on the promise, and she'd be known as the woman who couldn't keep her word. Honor it, and she'd have to watch her son propose to the help. That's when James stepped forward. Mother, he said quietly, but his voice carried across the marble like a bell. Before you answer, I'd like to say something. Victoria's eyes flashed warning, but James was beyond caring about her approval. Grace, he turned to face her, his formal posture softening into something genuine. When we danced tonight, for the first time in my life, I felt like I was dancing with someone who saw me. Not my trust fund, not my social position, not what I represent to this family's reputation. Just me. The crowd leaned forward, sensing drama that transcended mere social entertainment. I've been engaged to Priscilla for 6 months, James continued, his voice growing stronger. A perfectly suitable arrangement between perfectly suitable families, but tonight, dancing with you, I realized something important. Priscilla's face had gone white as fresh snow, her champagne glass trembling in her manicured fingers. I realized I don't want to be suitable. I don't want arrangements or mergers disguised as marriage. I want what my grandparents had, what I saw in that photograph of your parents. I want a partnership. I want someone who challenges me to be better than I am. He moved closer to Grace, close enough that she could see the sincerity burning in his eyes. So before my mother answers your challenge, Grace, I want to answer it myself. James dropped to one knee in the center of the ballroom, pulling a ring from his pocket. Not the massive diamond engagement ring meant for Priscilla, but a simple, elegant band that had belonged to his grandmother. Grace Thompson, daughter of champions, you don't need to marry into worth because you create your own. But would you consider creating it with me? The ballroom erupted. Priscilla shrieked and threw her champagne glass, which shattered against the marble with a sound like breaking promises. Several guests gasped. Mrs. Ashford clapped her hands together in delight. Phones captured every angle of the most romantic proposal New York society had seen in decades. But Grace stepped back, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic. "James, no," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Stand up." "Please." The confusion in his eyes was heartbreaking, but he rose to his feet. "This isn't about you," Grace continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You're a good man, and you deserve someone who chooses you for all the right reasons. But I can't be that person." She looked around the ballroom, taking in the faces of people who had gone from mocking her to celebrating her in the span of 2 hours. "Your mother challenged me to prove I was worthy of marrying you. But the real question isn't whether I'm worthy of you. It's whether I need your approval to know my own value." She turned to face Victoria directly, her posture regal as any queen. "And the answer is no. I don't need to marry your son to prove I belong anywhere I choose to be. I don't need your permission to be extraordinary. I don't need anyone's validation to know that I am exactly who my father raised me to be." Grace began walking toward the ballroom's main entrance, her grandmother's dress trailing behind her like liquid moonlight. "Mrs. Whitmore, you asked if I could dance this waltz and marry your son. Well, I danced. I danced better than anyone in this room expected, including you. But I choose not to marry him, not because he's not worthy, but because I don't need marriage to a Whitmore to validate Samuel Thompson's daughter." She paused at the threshold, turning back one final time. "I quit. Effective immediately. Send my final paycheck to the address you have already investigated so thoroughly," James called after her. "Grace, wait! What about your mother's treatment? The money you need?" Grace smiled, and for the first time all evening it was completely free of calculation or performance. "James, tonight I remembered something important. I'm not just Samuel Thompson's daughter. I'm Samuel Thompson's daughter who can dance, and the world is full of people who pay very well to learn from champions." She walked out of the Whitmore mansion and into the night, leaving behind 200 stunned guests, one heartbroken young man, and a society matriarch whose carefully constructed world had just been demolished by a woman who refused to be diminished. The video of Grace's exit would go viral within the hour. The revolution had begun. 6 months later, Grace Thompson stood in the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Samuel Thompson Dance Academy in Harlem, watching her students prepare for their first recital. The space buzzed with energy 8-year-old Marcus practicing his waltz frame, teenage Sophia perfecting her tango walks, elderly Mr. Martinez learning salsa with his wife of 40 years. The viral video of her exit from the Whitmore Ballroom had changed everything. Within 24 hours, #GraceDances had been trending worldwide. The footage of her transformation from invisible maid to ballroom queen, captured on dozens of phones, told a story that resonated far beyond New York's elite circles. Dance studios are offering teaching positions. Television producers pitched reality shows. Sponsors lined up with endorsement deals. But it was Mrs. Ashford who had made the difference. The society matriarch had appeared at Grace's apartment 3 days after the party, carrying a check and a proposal that changed Grace's life. "My dear," Mrs. Ashford had said, settling into Grace's modest kitchen chair like it was a throne, "I've been thinking about what your father would have wanted for his legacy." She'd placed the check on the table, enough money to cover Grace's mother's treatment, her back rent, and the down payment on a dance studio in Harlem. The building had been a dance hall in the 1940s, where her father had first learned to move like poetry. "Consider it an investment," Mrs. Ashford had explained. "In talent, in dignity, and in proving that breeding has nothing to do with bloodlines and everything to do with character." The Samuel Thompson Dance Academy had opened 4 months ago. Grace taught everyone. Wall Street executives wanting to impress at corporate events, young couples preparing for weddings, children from the neighborhood whose parents worked 3 jobs but still found money for dance lessons because they understood dreams were as necessary as food. Her mother's treatment had been successful. The experimental drugs had worked, and Clara Thompson was now cancer-free and living in a small apartment near the studio, helping Grace with administrative work and fussing over students like they were her own grandchildren. Victoria Whitmore's world had crumbled with surgical precision. The viral video had exposed her cruelty to a global audience. Other former employees came forward with their own stories of humiliation and abuse. The scandal had cost Victoria her position on 3 charity boards, her membership in 2 exclusive clubs, and most devastating of all, her reputation as someone worthy of respect. James had surprised everyone by standing up to his mother completely. He'd broken his engagement with Priscilla, liquidated part of his trust fund, and donated $50,000 to establish the Samuel Thompson Scholarship Fund, providing free dance lessons to underprivileged children throughout New York City. He'd also tried, repeatedly, to reconnect with Grace. Flowers, letters, invitations to dinner, all politely declined. Grace harbored no ill will toward him, but she'd meant what she said that night. She didn't need anyone's love to validate her worth, even love as genuine as his seemed to be. "Miss Grace," Marcus called from across the studio floor, his small arms struggling with the proper waltz frame. "Am I doing it right?" Grace moved toward him with the fluid grace that had captivated a ballroom and conquered the internet. She adjusted his posture gently, the way her father had done for her 20 years ago. "Remember, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned that strength came from knowing your own value. "Dancing isn't about being perfect. It's about telling your story with your whole heart." Through the studio's windows, she could see the Harlem neighborhood where she'd grown up, where her father had taught her that every person deserved to dance, regardless of where they came from or how much money their parents had. The children in her classes came from the same streets, carried the same dreams, faced the same obstacles. But now they had something she'd lost for 18 years, a place where their talents mattered more than their addresses, where effort was rewarded instead of breeding, where they could learn that grace wasn't something you married into, but something you cultivated from within. Her phone buzzed with a text from a reporter wanting to do a follow-up story. "Dance teacher who rejected Millionaire's son, where is she now?" Grace deleted it without reading past the preview. She had no interest in being defined by what she'd walked away from. Her story wasn't about rejecting James Whitmore or humiliating his mother. It was about remembering who she'd always been and choosing to be that person regardless of the cost. At 6 o'clock, as her last student left for the day, Grace stood alone in the studio. She moved to the sound system, selected her father's favorite song, the same one that had played during her parents' wedding dance, and began to move. She danced for the 8-year-old girl who'd dreamed of stages and spotlights. She danced for the 19-year-old who'd given up those dreams to save her family. She danced for every woman who'd ever been told she wasn't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough. And she danced for her father, whose legacy lived on in every student who learned that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves to dance. 1 year after that fateful night, Grace received an unexpected visitor. Victoria Whitmore stood in the doorway of the Samuel Thompson Dance Academy, her designer clothes impeccable, but something fundamental had changed in her bearing. The imperial confidence was gone, replaced by what looked like humility. "Grace," she said quietly, "I came to apologize." Grace gestured toward her office, curious despite herself. Victoria had aged visibly. The scandal had taken its toll. "Not because my publicist advised it," Victoria continued, but because watching what you built here made me realize something. Worth isn't inherited, it's demonstrated, every single day, by how we treat others. Grace nodded slowly. My father always said the measure of a person isn't where they start. It's how they finish. Victoria's smile was sad but genuine. He raised an extraordinary daughter. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. After Victoria left, Grace stood in her father's studio, surrounded by dreams he'd nurtured and the legacy she was continuing. That night seemed like a lifetime ago, when a millionaire mocked a maid and learned that talent doesn't bow to money. Dignity isn't for sale, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is know your own worth. Victoria Whitmore had said, "Dance this waltz, you can marry my son." Grace has proven that a woman who can truly dance doesn't need to marry anyone for validation. She creates her own stage, writes her own story, and teaches the world that everyone deserves to dance. Your turn to dance. If you were in Grace's position offered wealth in exchange for diminishing yourself, what would you choose? Would you take safety or risk everything for dignity? Drop your thoughts below. Watch again at 4:32. There's one detail showing Grace was always championship material. Can you spot it? If Grace's story moved you, it would support more stories about everyday heroes who refuse to stay invisible. Share this with someone who needs to remember their hidden talents. Subscribe to Black Soul Stories, and remember, everyone deserves to dance. Everyone deserves to choose. Everyone deserves to know their worth. Samuel Thompson, Dance Academy, where dreams learn to move.